Hi everyone, I'm Nancy Littlejohn with Nancy Littlejohn Fine Art in Houston, Texas, and we're here today to visit with our artist Christina Nicodema. This is her first solo show at the gallery. Christina is from New York, and the name of the show is called Mayfly, and we're just going to jump in with a very simple question and ask her, what is a mayfly, and why did you select that title for the show?
Sure. So the mayfly, for those of you who don't know, is an insect that lives for one day after it's passed out of the larva stage. And for me, the mayfly was really evocative of this kind of ephemeral nature of our life here on Earth. And when you have an insect that lives for one day, one spin of the Earth, we can really sort of digest that. So versus 50 years, 100 years, which is a little bit too abstract. So I thought of the mayfly as the sort of housekeeper of death. And it brings into clarity this reality of our own sort of mortality. And we become super aware of it when we see an insect that lives for one day.
Do you, in one of these paintings, is there a great example of that you can point out?
For sure. So, well, actually, we can talk about this piece right here, this Freak Shake Mountain, because I'm dealing with the ephemeral nature of life on a number of levels. And so Freak Shake Mountain, for me, it's a landfill, right, of these cakes that have never been eaten. And it's talking about how we are consuming, and we live in this very consumerist culture that is very much marked by addiction, and all of this imagery is sourced from the internet, and we live so much of our lives online today, and we are consuming visually on the internet, and it's very much how we communicate today. So Freak Shake Mountain is sort of evocative of the sort of civilization that has reached its peak, right? A civilization is also an ephemeral thing. It's not forever. It has a lifespan, very much like the mayfly. Right. And a civilization on its way up, there's sort of a, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is a bit closer. And as it's reached its peak, or its true flowering, we see a bigger gap between the haves and the have-nots. So we're looking at this sort of dumpster landfill of all of these ridiculous cakes, and it's over the top and excessive, and there's no rest. And I'm really talking about that moment of a true flowering, of a peak attraction, the pinnacle, just before it's about to unravel. And that was very sort of timely for me right now, given the time that we've been in a global pandemic. It's been, we're asking these kinds of questions, right?
So that leads me to the next question, because you did create these during quarantine. So can you share with us what you have learned in the last few months, and if any of these illuminations have manifested in your work?
Yeah, for sure. Much of this work was made during the pandemic, and certainly I responded to it a lot. And that was probably what got me thinking about the idea of human life and our time on Earth being such an ephemeral thing. So all of the underpinnings of the work and the things that I talk about dealing with our place in the food chain still exist. But here I'm really looking at civilization and that moment of true flowering, and right before something is about to turn, and it's really about transfer of energy. So, for example, it can be found in other works as well, where you have the piece of fruit, right, or the flower, that it's at its peak moment, its true flowering, where it is the most attractive, right, and it's luring in the insects. Or even, for instance, in the whale painting, we have this whale, and it's this gory carcass, which to us is perhaps horrific, but it is at its peak ripeness for something else. And that moment of peak ripeness and peak attraction is so fleeting, because it turns right after, and it's all about this transfer of energy.
Definitely. So we've talked about this quite a bit. Some of the examples of Christina's favorite artists would be, let's just say these are a nod to Dutch still life, where everything is at that most beautiful, the brightest bloom. There are nods to Wayne Thiebaud with the cakes and the lusciousness of the paint itself. And then there's that element of the Hieronymus Bosch, where something that is so fantastical leans towards the grotesque as well. So with that said, let's talk about the compelling combination between the beauty and then the devastation. And how do you find a balance between those two opposites?
So that's a great question. And as I mentioned before, so much of our life is on the internet. And I'm a millennial, so I'm from this very digitally native generation, right? And certainly the younger generations have grown up with screens. So it's really changed how we receive content and how we see color. Right. And we are just bombarded by content nonstop, and we're addicted to it. We are addicted to consuming visually. And when you're on the internet and on Instagram, for example, you vacillate between images that are totally horrific to pure escapism, one after the other, and they start to sort of blend, and we become almost desensitized in a way to what we're actually seeing. And in this work, there is a lot of that is horrific or grotesque, and I'm really playing with this idea of attraction and repulsion. And when you look at the painting, you're not hit with what is darker first. No. You're sort of hit with this color, and I am dealing with maximalism as a way to talk about abstraction in work that is so figurative. And it takes you a second, and although what is grotesque about the work might be right in front of your face, you don't see it at first, and it takes you a minute to really register that, much like how we're operating in our daily lives.
It's so true.
Yeah.
It's so true. So let's talk about some of the animals and the foliage in the paintings that aren't so easily recognizable.
Yeah.
So are any of these endangered species, or some of these things extinct? And then why have you decided to talk about them?
So there is a range of animals, from like a house cat, for example, that is super familiar to most of us, to some more exotic things like some of these super interesting primates. So I'm talking about a range of wildlife and putting them in sort of these impossible situations and seemingly disparate objects and creatures together as a way of discussing how we view these things on the internet. And also the internet, I mean, I source the internet, and I forgot to mention this, but the internet I treat it as our societal collective unconscious, right? Because it's connecting all of us, and we have access to anything at any time. Right. And I do deal with endangered species sometimes, and then sometimes species that are more familiar. And I am interested in why we emote the way that we do when we experience an animal. And so for example, people ask me about the primates a lot, and there's such a range of monkeys, and oftentimes they're doing things that are very, very human and very relatable to us. So we look at that and we emote, and it resonates for us, right? Because and we start to see that we're not as far away from these other life forms on the planet.
Exactly.
And we're at a place where I think we're at a fork in the road in a very real way, and we are deciding, I guess, or being asked if we are willing to relitigate our relationship with the planet.
Right. It's interesting, that nod to the primates, because when you look at the work and you see how close we are to them, I think it kind of brings out our sense of compassion.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, when you see one of these beautiful creatures holding their child, you think, well, my goodness, they look just like us.
Right.
Right? Their mannerisms are so similar to ours.
For sure. And then you start to ask this question of, okay, we're looking at our place in the food chain, and you start to realize we've assigned this hierarchy to life on Earth, right? And it's kind of arbitrary, and it changes over time and from culture to culture. What is food? What isn't food? What is our family pet that we love, perhaps like a child?
Right, right.
So how do we assign value to a life? And we have a sort of spiritual problem with the uncomfortable truth that we must take life to sustain life. So we have to put our blinders on and compartmentalize a lot of it.
Well said. So because each one of these paintings in and of itself is very much a tour de force. So when you're working, sometimes you don't know where to start looking. And how do you, this is a multi-layered question, but how do you start a work? Do you finish one work before you move on to the next? Or do you work on these simultaneously? And how do you know when the image is resolved?
That's a great question. So I would say that I am always in my process, meaning I am always sort of scouring the internet for inspiration and content. So if I'm home relaxing, I'm doing the thing where I'm looking through my phone and I'm going on deep dives, and it takes me to all of these points of research. And so I'm always collecting information, research, and imagery. But when I actually sit down to construct a painting, I have an image library of hundreds of thousands of images.
I can only imagine.
It's a lot. And I will bring them into Photoshop, and I can start with like hundreds of images in a Photoshop composition, and I start to chop them up, and I paint in Photoshop as well. And I have a whole toolkit that I use digitally, and I get rid of stuff and I change stuff. And as soon as I get to a place where it might be like two colors start to click and I get a hook in the composition for me, I can start to build around that. And I have a moment where I see it and I kind of know it's going to work as a painting. But the painting part of it is an entirely different part of the process, because I've taken information that is from this digital landscape, right? And now the question is, how do I make this about paint? What does it mean in paint?
Definitely.
And how do I deal with it? So the painting process, it is about really destroying this digital underpainting and making choices, right? What do I change? What is loose? What gets more abstracted? And what is maybe rendered a little bit tighter? And how do I know when it's resolved? It's really an intuitive feeling. I kind of feel it when there's a balance and it's working. Some of these took more time to resolve than others. And I only really deal with one painting at a time, because they demand 100% of my bandwidth, every single one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing that I've noticed, because these images are very Instagrammable images. So lots of people who see these works on Instagram or in an image, they think that they're digital because that's the way they come across. But then they walk into the gallery and they think, oh my word, this is painting. And they are really blown away. So how do you like your work to be viewed? And is that intentional? Do you know that's a hook and that people might not understand that you are actually painting until they see them up close and personal?
That's kind of a trick of the process. So it works in a way visually on Instagram, because even though they're painting, they have origins in a digital place. So it translates in a funny way. Is that, however, it is critical that these paintings be viewed in person to get a sense of the paint stroke. There's so much texture, and the paint is really activated. And that is such an important part of the work, because it is so much about painting and transcending its digital roots. And then you get a sense of the scale, and the scale is really important, how it feels in the room with you in it and what that experience is for you. So I do prefer them to be viewed in person. Yeah.
And that answers another interesting question, and that is, during this time of COVID, people keep asking, does art need to be seen in person? Why can't we just look at it, online? But it just doesn't translate. It is not the same feeling, and this show is case in point. I mean, this was sort of our first foray into letting people come into the gallery very cautiously, and everyone said they needed this moment. They needed to come in and see something in person, and how much they missed the gallery experience and how much they missed being able to stand in front of a magnificent work of art. It's not the same thing as a swipe on an Instagram feed. And this is a very simple question, and our last one, unless anyone has any questions. So, why cakes?
Okay, well, we'll get right to it. Why cake, right?
Why
Because
cake?
we're standing in front of a literal landfill of cake right now. Cake is so interesting to me because it really talks about the way that we fetishize food, and we not only consume it by eating it, but it is so critical that we consume it visually, and that is such a big part of how we deal with food. And food, our relationship to food is super emotional. It's linked to memory, both bad and good. It's linked to every culture on earth, right? And it is a sort of great equalizer. And cake is another way for me to talk about a culture that is marked by addiction, right? We are such an addicted culture. We are addicted to the internet, to content, to color, to food, to our emotions, to substance. So cake is the thing that sort of defies nature, and it's the first moment, like as a child, when we experience that sugar rush for the first time, that explosion, right, of feeling and all of the chemicals that it releases in the brain. So it's that first little hook into addiction, and also cakes being these extravagant sort of art objects that we do consume visually, they're taken so far away from the sources of everything that were taken, all of the lives that were put together to create these things that are seemingly now entirely removed.
I mean, think about the symbolism of a birthday cake.
Right.
I mean, it's something that you live for all year. I mean, what is your birthday if you don't get this thing?
I know.
Right?
And why is it so important to commemorate 1 year, right? 1 year around the sun, another year of life on Earth with this decorative, sugary food object.
Right, this confection.
Yeah.
And interestingly, in all of these images, the cake isn't just an ordinary cake. It is a cake with every visual cherry on top. I mean, can we have more icing, more cherries, more syrup, more everything, right?
Yeah.
It's magnificent. Oh my gosh. Okay, audience, does anyone have any questions? Okay.
I wanted to ask about the physicality of making these paintings.
Okay.
How you got to stand on a ladder, lie on the floor, and then how long did it take you? What is it that one?
So this one right here, this was the largest scale that I've ever done so far, and this was a really physical one just because of the sheer size of it. I couldn't even fit the stretchers in my studio, so I had to tack this canvas to the wall, and then I started with the bottom and worked my way up, and it was I really created apparatuses, like it started with a chair, then sawhorses with wood on top, and a stool, and then milk crates on top of that, and by the time I was at the top, it was this balancing act, right, because I couldn't even fit real scaffolding in my studio to really paint the top of it. So this was a very physical process, and I'm always sort of adjusting my height to sort of deal with a painting. Yeah.
Amazing.
So this one took, each painting takes, it really is different. It depends on how stuck I am. For this one, it took me probably a year to resolve the digital composition after multiple attempts and failures, trying to figure it out because there was so much information to deal with. So this one was probably like just a year in the making from start to finish, right before I could even sit down to start painting it.
Interesting.
Christina, great job.
Thank you.
Given so much of your themes about our relationships between humans and animals, or biodiversity, or consumerism, was it a very conscious decision to not pick humans?
That's a great question.
For sure, and it's a great question. What you see in these paintings, you don't see humans, but you see the human hand or the effect of humans. These are all like man-made sort of creations that could only exist, because of us. So that's sort of how what the human influence is in this work.
Okay. Anyone else? Emily?
I'm captivated by shipwreck, as you know. And again, it is a unlike the others, and they've chosen to put a painting within a painting.
Right.
And I just, if you could talk a little bit about your choice and why you picked that particular work.
So, I reference like so many artists from art history, and this particular artist, Ivan Aivazovsky, was a very well-known marine artist during the 1800s in Russia. Much of the work now lives in, I think, Russia and Ukraine in the museum, so it's perhaps a lesser-known, widely known name. But I thought the work was really beautiful, and it also to sort of appropriate an image and repaint it. It's like never how the work was intended to be viewed, much like how painting was never intended to be viewed or dealt with on the internet. So it's like a way to talk about content and our access to content. And in this painting, you see a lot of, it's all sort of primates doing these very human things. And you experience this range of very human emotions. We get into, certainly the maternal instinct is a big one. And there are pictures of breastfeeding monkeys and also a mother monkey mourning for her deceased baby. And for me, it was a really heartbreaking image to find, and it hit me so hard, and it really was a way for me to start thinking about why we emote in such a strong way when we deal with animals. So I wanted it to be an emotionally compelling painting that really got the audience to feel something.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and congratulations,
Thank you.
Christina, on a magnificent, magnificent show. Thank you.
Okay.